Hi everybody, welcome back to our lecture series based on the textbook Everything's an Argument. Today we're talking about Chapter 5, or Logical Fallacies. Logical fallacies are a very interesting and kind of fun way to go about thinking about arguments in a variety of different ways. Today we're going to address a few things. Number one, what is a logical fallacy? So we'll define it and briefly discuss. We'll talk about the three different categories of fallacies, which are fallacies of emotion, fallacies of ethics, fallacies of logic. And before we really address logical fallacies, what a fallacy is, anything like that, I want to offer a bit of advice or a bit of a warning related to logical fallacies. So logical fallacies can seem like a one-stop shop for accepting or dismissing any argument. And as we go through this, there's going to be reasons to support the idea that we should dismiss any argument that is using a logical fallacy or based on a logical fallacy. But I warn you against that, simply because there are so many different forms of logical fallacies. We're only going to go over a handful in this lecture, but I want to pull from my experience when I was coaching debate. While I was in graduate school, I was the assistant coach of the debate team at CSU Sacramento, and we traveled all over the country to many different tournaments. I judged a lot of debates at various levels, from kind of novice all the way up to the national championship debate one year. And during that time, I don't recall ever hearing a competitive debater call on a logical fallacy during a debate. So in my mind, if the top debaters in the country, the people that are going to be lawyers and politicians and change policy and make policy, if these people who spend their free time arguing competitively are not using logical fallacies offensively or to highlight errors in an argument, we probably shouldn't in our day-to-day lives either. They're interesting ideas. They're things to be aware of. They're things to highlight, right? To be able to say, this is that logical fallacy, and here's why that's a problem. And maybe it's a red flag for you when you're thinking or having an argument, but you don't want to use that logical fallacy to simply dismiss an argument. Again, because people who argue competitively don't. But also there are some arguments that are functional, that do exist in our public discourse, that are similar or based on logical fallacies, and we need to be able to engage with them and to listen to the argument, not just simply dismiss it. So, duly warned, logical fallacies are to be used lightly. We don't want to take them too seriously. So what is a logical fallacy? A logical fallacy is an argument that is flawed by its nature or structure. Pretty simple. So the very structure, the foundation of the argument is flawed, and that could be for any reason. And we'll go over some of those different reasons as we go through this. But I want you to think about, just for a second, does the inclusion of one or more logical fallacy in an argument immediately undermine that argument in its entirety? This is a good opportunity for you to pause and to take a second and to think about this. If an argument is fundamentally flawed at its very core, does that negate or take away from the power of that argument? Pause the video and think about it for just a minute, and then come back and we'll build from whatever conclusion you have come to. So first up are fallacies of emotion. These are fallacies that work to target human emotion. Pretty simple. They can be fear, they can be anger, they can be stress, they can be happiness. They can be a variety of different things, but typically they're going to focus on fear, on getting your audience, on getting somebody afraid of potential ramifications or effects. We will go over three different types of fallacies of emotion. They're called scare tactics, either or choices, and slippery slope. So first up, we have scare tactics, and this is when somebody who's arguing, a rhetor, an author, a speaker, uses frightening statistics or exaggerates the possible dangers of those things beyond their statistical likelihood. So for example, if somebody were to exaggerate the chances of being struck by lightning. That would be an example of a logical fallacy related to that topic. So we want to really think about this. We're going to see a lot of scare tactics in a lot of public discourse, especially related to climate change. And again, this is one of those times when we don't want to just simply dismiss it, because the argument might actually be sound, even though it does sound a little bit scary. So we have a newspaper clipping here from 1932. Melting glaciers would flood Earth's big cities. So almost 100 years later, and we're still having the same conversations, the same arguments about the impact of sea level rise. And whether you agree or disagree, right, the overall idea here is that we have a logical fallacy in that scare tactics, we are exaggerating the possible dangers beyond their statistical likelihood. There's really no evidence of statistics in this newspaper clipping, but we want to just think about it in that way. How likely is something to happen? And depending on your answer, that should impact how you think about it. There's a term in statistics called de minimis, which essentially means that the statistical likelihood, the probability of a thing happening is so low, it doesn't warrant even thinking about. If you do a little research on this idea, you'd be surprised at how many of the things that we talk about on a day-to-day basis actually fit into this idea of de minimis. Then we have either or choices. This is pretty simple. Either you do this or this bad thing will happen. This is also known as a false dilemma. So USA, love it or leave it, right? The idea here is that you break down a very, very complex idea into one or another option. It's either choose this option or this bad thing will happen, right? So with this little button, right, we get the idea. The argument here is that if you don't love the USA as it is now, leave, right? But that leaves the entire category of options of making structural, political, foundational change to the place that you live. That's a much more detailed argument than one or the other. So again, with logical fallacies, we just want to be aware of those ideas. The next step in the last fallacy of emotion that we're going to address is called slippery slope. In our little cartoon here, it says, if you let a bully come in your front yard, he will be on your porch the next day, and the day after that, he will eat your babies. We have our little turtle down here that says that escalated quickly. Because it did, and that's the primary thing with a slippery slope, is that it portrays any misstep as a major issue, as a digression, or leading to a massive issue, like having a bully eat your babies. The thing about this, though, is that slippery slope arguments do exist, and they're things that we want to pay attention to. For example, when I was coaching debate, there were a lot of arguments about biodiversity. And there are always these arguments about how a decrease in biodiversity of a particular type could lead to an ecosystem collapse, which would be very bad for all of us. That falls into the category of being a slippery slope logical fallacy, but it's true, right? So if biodiversity decreases to a certain extent, it could lead to a collapse in an ecosystem, and then that creates ripple effects and problems everywhere. So we want to think about logical fallacies in a complex way. We want to think about slippery slope fallacies specifically as becoming a problem when a person exaggerates the likely consequences of an action. So if the consequences of that action are sound, they're well reasoned, they're supported well, that's something we want to pay attention to. So we went over 3 logical fallacies that were related to fallacies of emotion. Now we're going to go over fallacies of ethics. These are meant to highlight a person's credibility or lack thereof. And this is a really, really interesting category of fallacy to me, because it really leans into this idea. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea that we are experts, that we know more about a thing than we actually do. And you'll be surprised at how often you might see these in your day-to-day lives. To really address this, we're just going to cover 3. We'll cover appeals to false authority, dogmatism, and my favorite, ad hominem arguments. So appeals to false authority are fallacies meant to highlight a person's credibility or lack thereof. An example of this is when people offer themselves or other authorities as experts or credible on something that's beyond their expertise. I was going over this with a class one time, and a student raised their hand and said, oh, that's interesting because I was just having an argument on Twitter with somebody recently, and they were talking about politics. I disagreed with them, and they said, well, I have a PhD in psychology. And their response was, your PhD in psychology doesn't necessarily make you an expert in this area related to politics. And they're not wrong, right? That idea that, oh, I have a doctoral degree in one field makes me an expert in all these other fields is an appeal to false authority. Now, granted, they might be very well educated and very well informed on that topic, but making that kind of appeal is technically a logical fallacy. The other type of fallacy that we have here is dogmatism. This is when a person asserts or assumes that a particular position is the only position that is acceptable. So it's an opinion that is stated as a fact. We're saying this is the only option. Crunchy peanut butter is better than creamy peanut butter. And I'm not willing to argue about it. There is no other side. Right? So this is, again, leads into the idea that our individual credibility, our perspectives on the world are much more valuable than maybe they actually are. It asserts that no other arguments are necessary and that the truth is self-evident. One of my favorite ways to think about this actually relates to flat earth argumentation, because a lot of that argumentation says, listen, look, use your brain, use your eyes, look, the evidence is right in front of you, the earth is flat. Go to a flat plain, go to the ocean and look and see it's flat, right? But there's a lot of other options to that. Primarily that the earth is so large we can't actually see the curvature except from certain perspectives and certain areas, and if you understand the math behind it, it's very easy to prove that that's incorrect. So dogmatism definitely exists all over the place. And this is one of my favorite logical fallacies. This is called ad hominem arguments. And this is the idea that it's okay to attack a person who is presenting an argument rather than the claims that they make or are making. So rather than engage with the argument, we say, hey, that can't be true because you're an idiot. Well, maybe it is true, right? And we don't want to attack that person. This gets a little bit tricky when we start thinking about character and how we value different people and different things. But the crux of this logical fallacy is that we want to avoid attacking the people making an argument and attack the logic, the reason that they're using to support that argument. That'll go a long way to helping you be more critical of arguments, but also to make better arguments and to check yourself, especially online when we're on comment sections on Facebook and Twitter and those kinds of things. It can be really easy to say, oh, you voted this way clearly from your page or your profile, or you think this, so therefore because you're wrong about this, you're an idiot about this too. And we want to avoid that because that keeps us from actually engaging with an argument, and we want to engage with that argument. We want to break it down and into its component parts and analyze how effective that argument is. Sometimes it's not going to be, but sometimes it might actually be. Last but not least, we have fallacies of logic. These are fallacies based on faulty reasoning. We will cover hasty generalization, faulty causality, and red herring. So first up, we have hasty generalization. And again, this is one of my favorites, especially if somebody doesn't have a firm grasp of how statistics works. It's very, very easy to do this, especially on a day-to-day basis. Not even with statistics, just on a day-to-day basis, we make a lot of these hasty generalizations. Our cartoon here says, I have never seen food that is not circle-shaped. All food is therefore definitely circle-shaped. We're basing it on that one observation. Our other character here says, I have never seen food that does not have straight edges or is not circle-shaped. Two different observations, two very different conclusions have been drawn. A hasty generalization is an inference drawn from insufficient evidence. There is not enough evidence to support that idea. In summary, it's a conclusion reached without considering all variables. Therefore, the point would be no good. We want to evaluate all of the variables at play before we draw a conclusion. And maybe not all the variables at play, but as many of the variables as we can, so that we can draw the most sound conclusion from whatever information we are looking at. Next up, we have faulty causality or post hoc. This is another really, really common one, and it's the assumption that because one event or action follows another, then the first event must have caused the second event. Faulty causality is the idea that because one thing happens after another, the first thing caused that to happen. And that's not necessarily the case. For example, if I am on my way to work and I leave my house 5 minutes late because I woke up 5 minutes late, and I'm on track to get to work on time, and I hit that one red light, and then I end up being 3 minutes late to work or 2 minutes late to work. I might tell my boss, "Oh, I'm so sorry I'm late. I just hit so many red lights on my way here." But that's not what actually caused me to be late to work. What caused me to be late to work was waking up 5 minutes late, right? So faulty causality is a really, really interesting one. And the idea there, and this is a really, really important idea and very simple idea in statistics, is that correlation, so two things that appear to be connected, right? They correlate with each other. Correlation does not equal causation. So just because two things look like they're related doesn't mean that they actually are, and we have to do more analysis in order to draw that conclusion that one thing caused another. Our cartoon here says, false causality on the offense, coincidence illegally substituted for proof. We want to be really, really aware of that because causation is very, very difficult to prove, and we can often just simply say, oh, this is a coincidence, therefore that means it's something caused this to happen. So just be aware of that. Our last fallacy of the day is red herring. And this fallacy occurs when somebody changes the subject abruptly or introduces an irrelevant claim or fact to throw you off. That is super common, right? It involves us purposefully or accidentally avoiding engaging with an argument for really any reason. Our cartoon here, I know it's hard to read, so I'll read it to you. It says, "Yeah, well, I only failed my logic exam because I'm a Pisces and my professor's a Leo." So rather than engage with the reasoning behind why they failed that exam, our cartoon here shows that something that's completely irrelevant, and that's zodiac signs, impacted that person's ability to pass the exam because they had clashing personalities. So the idea here with a red herring is it's anything that is added into an argument to throw you off, to trip you up, to make you think about something different. And these, again, are very, very common in our day-to-day life. So in review, this was a rather short lecture. We went over what a logical fallacy is, 3 types of fallacies of emotion, 3 types of fallacies of ethics, 3 types of fallacies of logic. Ultimately, what you want to do is use your newfound understanding of logical fallacies to think more critically about arguments. Not just other people's arguments, your arguments. To really think about what you're saying and if it is structurally sound. We want to engage with arguments. We don't just want to say, oh, that's a logical fallacy, bad argument, get out of here, right? So just be aware of that. Use this to make better arguments for yourself. I hope this has helped you gain a better understanding of logical fallacies and will hopefully help you make better arguments in the future. Take care, everybody.